Yeah. A little bit colder morning. And January has been so mild that Aamu has started to shed. No, we haven't trekked much. Reason being, very wet. But it's actually been below freezing tonight, so not enough. Did you see something? Should do something about this tree. Still some fireworks going on. It was kind of bad yesterday. I think they were up in the wood, in this forest actually. We didn't come far yesterday. They had used fireworks before we went out, so she wasn't thrilled getting out. We probably got like 200 meters and then boom, this direction. And I wanted to go home. I haven't decided on anything yet. I think we do a spring trip, Aamu. I'm not sure where though. A little afraid that this weather will have a massive backlash. Because I mean, it's still winter, supposed to be. It's not unusual here. We are seaside, so every now and then we had these winters that never really turned into winter. Sweetie, eh? Why can't we go the normal way? Because you don't want to. Yeah, you're correct, Aamu. I see it. Doesn't look overly worried for you, Aamu. Let's not harass that one. Yeah. I know. Yeah, we're going down towards it. Correct. Can we? For once. It's actually closer to the squirrel. Should we test this Aamu? I'm not really sure, but we can test it. Yeah. I know. Nah, too big, Aamu. Too big. Yeah, it's too big. It's too big and it's in the way. You're in the way as well. No, it's too big, Aamu. Really? Yeah, this works fine. You should do this more. Oh, doggos. Yeah, it's doggos. Loose doggos. They were playing Aamu. Yeah, the rodeo here. It's a fine morning. Not much wind. Still quite wet. I mean, the frost in the night doesn't really help. The ground is so warm. We can see that in all the creeks and lakes and so on. Water levels are really high, really high. Hey, sweetie. So we are planning to do what we did last year. A spring trip around the 1st of May. Going up north. We climbed. Last year was... Yeah, we did climb. Doing på fjället was interesting. And then we have hunting in the autumn. Still looks like people are walking here, but down there looks like thorns, fallen trees and wet. It's the last little edge of this forest. Pretty much the only time I walk it is in winter. But it's kind of funny how this one has evolved over time. What are you looking at? No. You don't know, Aamu. I see it on you. You know we're heading that way, right? What do you see? I think she got a sniff of something. Yeah, we'll take the full one today. Yeah, they went that way. Okay, Aamu rolled. Yeah, I know. Yeah, I know. Oh yeah, you're shedding Aamu. This is funny. I have to brush you later. Yeah, now you're barking. The thing is, you're barking on... Every time I try to walk, she goes back to the stick. This is why I'm trying to walk, Aamu. Because I think the common dog goes. There are more people walking, you know. People in the forest now, yeah. You had to do that and pretend it was a stick. Okay? There are people in the forest, I know. They're allowed to be here. I'm a little bit annoyed with that, actually. When there are the people in places where normally you don't meet people, she has to verify who they are. So she... Oh. Whoa. Whoa. That's a bird of prey, huh? I think that was a duvhök. I don't know the name in English. I will check that out. Don't see them often here. Well, they do exist. Don't see them often. I'll be walking slow because they are behind us. He says so. And they are not walking the same way, Aamu. What did you find now? A stick. It's a small stick, Aamu. It's a good stick. They're going to debark it. Tearing it apart. Oh, they're still there. Having the kids out and building something? Treehouse or something? I'd rather walk times when people are not out. Yeah, and the birds are chirping. I'm seeing prep. Yeah. It's a little foggy still. I heard it. Could be people, it could be roadie ammo. It was kind of heartbreaking a while there. When we came home after New Year. And she wanted to go back to the car. She was telling me she wanted us to go away somewhere. That broke my heart. Yeah, it did, that one. Yeah, I know, Aamu. They have dogs there. Yeah, and that's why we're not going there. Yeah, exactly. That's why we are not going there. The dogs are playing. Yeah, sweetie, we are not going there. Blackbird. Blackbirdie. Aamu, why the hurry? Yeah, why the hurry? I know you want to go to the other dogs, but we're not going to the other dogs. They are playing up there, I know. It's a good one though. It's an autopilot today.